Let me start with something that lives in the space between being seen and being known. Some people spend years loving someone who never understood them, not because they did not try to explain, but because the other person could not or would not see who they actually were. Not their body, not their presence, but the internal world they carried, the way they thought, the way they felt, the way they moved through life, the complexity of who they were beneath what could be easily observed. And the strange part is not just that they were misunderstood, it is that they kept trying, they kept explaining, they kept hoping that if they could just find the right words, the right examples, the right way of expressing themselves, finally the other person would understand. Finally they would be seen. Finally the gap between who they were and who they were perceived to be would close. But the gap never closed, and the trying never stopped. And the exhaustion of constant misinterpretation became the baseline of the relationship. Many of these people do not realize how deep this pattern runs until they are adults. They look back and notice that they spent entire relationships translating themselves, entire friendships performing simplified versions of who they actually were, entire childhoods being told they were something they were not, and they accepted it. They accepted being called too sensitive when they were simply feeling, being called too complicated when they were simply being honest, being called difficult when they were simply being themselves. They accepted these labels because everyone around them agreed. Parents, partners, friends, all seemed to see them the same way, as too much, as hard to understand, as requiring more effort than they were worth. And so they learned. They learned that who they actually were was not acceptable, that their authentic self was too complicated for others to hold, that if they wanted to be loved, they needed to become someone simpler, someone easier, someone less. This creates a specific psychological imprint that most people never put into words. It is not low self-esteem in the traditional sense, though shame is often present. It is not social anxiety, though fear of being seen can develop. It is something more specific. It is conditional authenticity. The belief that being fully yourself comes at a cost. That authenticity must be rationed, not offered freely. That there is a version of you that is lovable and a version that is not. And your job is to figure out which is which, to show only the acceptable parts, to hide the parts that are too complicated, too intense, too much. And over time, this constant self-editing becomes so automatic that you forget you are doing it. You forget there was ever a version of yourself that you hid, because the performed version, the managed version, the simplified version, becomes the only version you know how to be. What makes this particularly painful is that the misunderstanding often comes from people they love, not strangers, not distant acquaintances, but parents who should have known them, partners who claim to love them, friends who spent years with them. These are the people who should have understood, who had access, who had time, who had intimacy, and yet they did not understand, or they understood a version, a simplified version, a version that fit their expectations, their comfort level, their capacity, but not the actual person. And so the person learned to live with this gap, the gap between who they were and who they were seen as. And the gap became normal, became expected, became the way connection worked. You show up, you explain yourself, they misunderstand anyway, and you adapt, you adjust, you become someone they can grasp. Because being misunderstood completely is more lonely than being partially known, even if what is known is not actually you. The paradox lives in the body as much as the mind. There is a physical exhaustion that comes from constant self-translation, from monitoring every word before it is spoken, from converting every authentic feeling into an acceptable version, from performing a self that is not quite yourself. And this exhaustion is not just mental, it is cellular. It is the tiredness that comes from never resting, never being off, never allowing yourself to simply be without calculation, without editing, without the constant internal question, is this going to be misunderstood? And the answer is usually yes, it probably will be. And so you prepare, you soften, you explain, you manage the perception before it can form incorrectly. And in doing so, you prevent yourself from ever being known. Because what they are knowing is not you, it is the translated version, the managed version, the version you hope they can understand, and they love that version, or they say they do. But you know, somewhere deep inside, that what they love is not real, that if they saw the actual you, the untranslated you, the complex you, they would not stay. They would be confused, overwhelmed, uncomfortable. And so you keep translating, keep performing, keep hiding, because the alternative, being rejected for who you actually are, feels unbearable. And here is what most people do not understand. The person who is chronically misunderstood is not being difficult. They are not choosing to be complicated. They are not performing complexity to seem interesting, or deep, or special. They are simply being themselves. And themselves happens to be more nuanced than the people around them can or will acknowledge. They contain contradictions. They feel multiple things at once. They hold complexity that does not reduce to simple categories. And this is not a choice, it is their nature. And their nature, they learned, is unacceptable. Not because it is bad, but because it is inconvenient, because it requires effort to understand, because it does not fit into the boxes others have ready. And so they are told, implicitly or explicitly, to fit, to simplify, to be easier. And when they cannot, when simplicity is not possible because it would require erasing fundamental parts of themselves, they are told they are the problem. Too much, too complicated, too hard to understand. And they believe it, not because it is true, but because everyone says it. And when everyone says the same thing, you start to think maybe they are right. Maybe you are too much. Maybe you are fundamentally difficult. Maybe being yourself is simply not an option if you want to be loved. This is the psychology of the person who loves someone who did not understand them. It is not a story of one misunderstanding. It is a story of pattern, of a lifetime of being seen inaccurately, of being loved for a version that did not exist, of performing a self to maintain connection, of hiding the complexity that felt too threatening to reveal, and of the deep, bone-level loneliness that comes from being with someone while feeling completely unknown. This loneliness is not the obvious kind, not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being together and still unseen, of being loved in theory but not in reality, of having someone claim to know you while consistently getting you wrong. And this loneliness, this specific kind of invisible loneliness, shapes everything. It shapes how they love, how they connect, how they understand themselves, how they move through the world. Because when the people closest to you cannot see you accurately, you start to wonder if there is something about you that is fundamentally unseeable, fundamentally unknowable, fundamentally wrong, and that wondering becomes belief, and the belief becomes identity, and you spend your life trying to fix what was never broken, trying to simplify what was never complicated, trying to be understood by people who are never willing to try. As a child, being understood is supposed to feel natural, not earned, not performed, not explained endlessly, just received. When you express yourself, someone gets it. When you feel something, someone recognizes it. When you are yourself, someone sees you accurately. This is how children learn who they are, through reflection, through being seen by the people who care for them, through watching how others respond to their authentic expression, and learning, yes, this is me, this is real, this is acceptable. And when this reflection is accurate, when parents and caregivers see the child for who they actually are, the child develops a coherent sense of self. They learn they are knowable. They learn they make sense. They learn that being themselves is not only acceptable but valuable. And this learning becomes the foundation of everything else, of confidence, of connection, of the ability to be authentic in relationships, because they learned early that authenticity is safe, that being seen is possible. That understanding is the natural response to honest expression. When understanding arrives naturally, the child learns that confusion is temporary, that when they say something unclear, someone will ask questions, that when they express something complicated, someone will sit with the complexity, that their internal experience, however nuanced, however contradictory, however difficult to articulate, matters, and is worth the effort it takes to understand. They learn that relationships can hold complexity, that people are capable of seeing beyond surface presentations, that love includes the work of knowing. And this creates security, not just emotional security, but existential security. The sense that the world is capable of understanding them, that they are not fundamentally alien, that being themselves connects them to others rather than isolating them. And so they move through life with the expectation that understanding is possible, that when they are authentic, people will see them, and when people see them, connection happens, and this expectation shapes everything, makes relationships easier, makes authenticity less risky, makes being known feel natural rather than terrifying. But when a child is not understood, when their inner world is consistently misinterpreted, they notice everything. They notice that who they are does not match who they are told they are. They notice the gap between their internal experience and others' perception of them. They notice that being themselves seems to confuse people, or annoy them, or disappoint them. They notice that when they express something honestly, it gets translated into something else, something simpler, something less accurate, something that fits better with what others expect, and so they learn something different. They learn that authenticity is risky, that being themselves is not safe, that understanding is not automatic, and that if they want to be loved, they need to become someone else, someone simpler, someone who fits the expectations others bring to them, someone who does not require effort to understand. This learning is not intellectual, it is experiential. It happens in moments. The child says they are sad, and the parent says you're fine. The child expresses excitement and is told to calm down. The child shares a complicated feeling and is told they are overthinking. The child is themselves and is told they are being difficult. And each moment teaches the same lesson. Who you are is not acceptable. What you feel is not accurate. How you see yourself is wrong. And over time, these moments accumulate. They build a foundational belief, a belief that lives deeper than thought, that operates below conscious awareness, that shapes every interaction that follows. The belief is simple but devastating. I am fundamentally misunderstood. And if I am fundamentally misunderstood, then I am fundamentally unlovable as I am. So I must become someone else, someone understandable, someone acceptable, someone less complicated, someone they can love. And so the child adapts, but the adaptation does not look like self-expression. It looks like self-editing. It looks like learning to monitor every word before it is spoken, every feeling before it is expressed, every authentic impulse before it is acted upon. The child becomes an expert translator of their own experience. They learn to take what they actually feel and convert it into something acceptable. They learn to simplify complexity, to reduce nuance, to perform emotions that fit expectations rather than express emotions that are real. And adults often praise this. What a mature child. So reasonable, so easy to deal with. But what they are really seeing is a child who has learned that being themselves is dangerous. That authenticity leads to misunderstanding, and misunderstanding leads to rejection. So they hide, they perform, they translate, and the translation becomes so automatic that eventually they forget what they were translating from. They forget who they actually were beneath the performance, because the performance has been going on so long that it feels like the only self that exists. The child without understanding learns one powerful lesson early. Who I actually am is not acceptable, so I must become someone else, someone simpler, someone easier, someone they can understand. And that belief shapes everything that follows. It shapes how they enter relationships, how they express themselves, how they understand their own worth, how they navigate conflict, how they respond to intimacy. Every situation becomes an opportunity to either hide or risk being seen, and hiding always feels safer. Because being seen once meant being misunderstood, and being misunderstood felt like proof that something about you was wrong. So hiding becomes protection, becomes survival, becomes the only way to maintain connection. And the person learns to live in hiding, not physically, but emotionally, psychologically, authentically. They are there, but they are not really there, because the real them is hidden, protected, kept safe from the misunderstanding that once defined their early experiences of trying to be known. There is a specific type of psychology that develops when your authentic self is consistently misread. It is not low self-esteem in the traditional sense. It is not social anxiety, though elements of both might be present. It is something more specific. It is conditional authenticity. The belief that being fully yourself is acceptable only in limited doses, only in certain contexts, only with certain people, only when you have earned it. And earning it means proving first that you can be simple, that you can be easy, that you can be what they expect, and only once that is established, only once you have demonstrated that you are manageable, might you be able to reveal small pieces of the actual you, small enough that they do not overwhelm, small enough that they do not confuse, small enough that they can be integrated into the simplified version you have already presented, but never all at once, never fully, never in a way that requires significant effort to understand, because effort you learned, is something people are unwilling to provide, at least not for you. This conditional authenticity creates a constant internal calculation. In every interaction, there is a question being asked beneath the surface. How much of myself can I show? How complicated can I be? How honest can I express myself before it becomes too much? And the answer to these questions is never clear. It varies by person, by context, by mood, and so the person is always guessing, always recalibrating, always monitoring the other person's response to determine whether they have revealed too much or whether they are still safely within the bounds of acceptable complexity. And this monitoring is exhausting. It is constant. It never stops. Even in moments that should feel relaxed, even with people who claim to love them, the monitoring continues. Because the fear of being misunderstood is stronger than the desire to be known. Because being misunderstood once led to rejection, or at least it felt like it did. And the nervous system does not forget. It stays alert, stays vigilant, stays ready to translate, to simplify, to hide, at the first sign that authenticity is becoming too much. The belief that drives this pattern is clear. If I am fully myself, I will not be loved. This belief feels like truth. It feels like wisdom learned from experience. It feels like the accurate assessment of how the world works. Because the world, or at least the people in it, did not love them fully, did not understand them fully, did not accept them fully. And so the conclusion seems obvious. The problem is me. I am too much, too complicated, too difficult to understand. And the solution is also obvious. I must become less complicated, less intense, less authentic, more manageable, more simple, more acceptable. And so they work. They work on simplifying themselves, on reducing their complexity, on becoming the version that is easier to love, not the version that is true, but the version that is tolerable. And this work, this constant effort to be less than they are, becomes the background of their entire life, becomes the constant hum beneath every interaction, becomes the price they pay for connection. And they pay it, over and over, for years, for decades, for entire lifetimes. Because the alternative, being rejected for who they actually are, feels more terrifying than spending their life hiding. This is why many people who are never understood become adults who hide themselves. Not because they are ashamed in the traditional sense, not because they think there is something morally wrong with who they are, but because being seen fully once meant being misunderstood completely. And being misunderstood felt like rejection, felt like proof that they were too much, felt like evidence that who they were required more effort than they were worth. And so hiding became protection, became the way to prevent future misunderstanding, became the strategy for maintaining connection without risking the pain of being seen accurately and having that accuracy be rejected. So they hide, they perform, they translate, they become versions of themselves that are acceptable, and the actual them, the complex them, the contradictory them, the nuanced them stays hidden, safe, protected, but also unknown, unseen, unloved. Not because love is not present, but because the love that is present is for someone who does not actually exist. Another deep imprint of chronic misunderstanding is how these individuals learn to translate themselves. They become expert translators of their own experience, expert converters of authentic feeling into acceptable expression, expert simplifiers of complex internal states, They learn to take what they actually feel and express something else, something easier, something that fits within the emotional vocabulary others can understand. They learn that saying "I am devastated" is too much, so they say "I am sad." They learn that saying "I am furious" creates discomfort, so they say "I am frustrated." They learn that expressing the full depth and intensity of their experience overwhelms others, so they reduce, they soften, they minimize, not because they want to, but because the full truth they learned is unacceptable. This translation happens automatically. It is not a conscious decision. It is a reflex developed over years of being told that their emotional expression was wrong, too much, too intense, overreacting, being dramatic, and so they learn to modulate, to edit, to present emotions in doses that others can tolerate, and this modulation is constant. It happens before they even recognize they are doing it. Something happens, they feel something, and before the feeling can be expressed, it is translated, converted, reduced, and what comes out is not what they felt, it is what they learned to say instead. And this gap, the gap between what they feel and what they express, becomes normal, becomes expected, becomes the way emotion works. They stop noticing that there is a translation happening. They stop recognizing that what they say is not what they feel, because the translation has been happening so long that it feels like the only way to communicate. The problem is that translation prevents intimacy. Real intimacy requires authentic expression. It requires saying what you actually feel, not what you think the other person can handle. It requires showing the complexity, the intensity, the depth of your internal experience. And when that is constantly translated into something simpler, something safer, something more acceptable, the other person never actually knows you. They know the translated version. They know the simplified version. They know the version you learned to present. But they do not know the version you actually are. And so the intimacy that exists is partial, incomplete, based on a performance rather than reality. And the person doing the translating knows this. They know they are hiding. They know the connection is incomplete. They know that what is being loved is not fully them, but they continue. Because the alternative, expressing authentically and risking being misunderstood, feels more dangerous than maintaining the partial connection they have. And so the pattern continues. They feel something, they translate it, they express the translation, the other person responds to the translation, and the person feels simultaneously connected and alone. Connected because there is response, alone because the response is not to them, it is to the translated version. And this dynamic, this constant translation and partial connection becomes the norm, becomes what relationships feel like, becomes what love means, and they accept it. Because they do not know there is another option. They do not know that some people can handle authentic expression, that some people appreciate complexity, that some people would rather struggle to understand the real thing than easily grasp a simplified version. They do not know this because they never experienced it. And so they keep translating, keep performing, keep hiding, and the exhaustion of constant translation becomes the price they pay for connection, and they pay it without question, because they were taught that connection requires translation, that being loved requires being less than you are, that authenticity is a luxury they cannot afford if they want to be known. Psychologically, this is the mind trying to maintain connection by making itself understandable. If I translate myself into something they can grasp, maybe they will stay. But translation is not connection. It is just performed simplicity. It is showing a version that is easier to digest while hiding the version that is real. And the person knows this. Somewhere deep inside, they know that what is being loved is not actually them. That the connection is built on a performance. That if they stopped translating, if they expressed authentically, the relationship would change or end. And so they keep translating, keep performing, keep maintaining the illusion that who they are is simple enough to be easily loved. When the truth is they are not simple, they are complex. And complex, they learned, is not something people want to deal with. So they make it look simple, and hope no one notices that beneath the simplicity is depth they were told not to show. Another trait often seen in people who were never understood is their relationship with being too much. They carry a constant fear that they are overwhelming, that their intensity, their complexity, their depth is a burden others must tolerate rather than a gift to be appreciated. They apologize for their emotions, for their needs, for their very existence. They make themselves smaller preemptively before anyone asks them to. They soften their expression before anyone says they are too loud. They simplify their thoughts before anyone says they are too complicated. They hide their needs before anyone says they are too demanding. This preemptive shrinking is constant, automatic, exhausting, and it is driven by one core belief. If I am fully myself, I will be too much, and too much means unlovable. This belief shows up in language, in how they apologize. Sorry, I know I am complicated. Sorry, I am probably overthinking this. Sorry, I am being too emotional. Sorry, I am too much. These apologies are not casual. They are not polite social conventions. They are genuine expressions of internalized shame. Shame about being who they are. Shame about having depth. Shame about not fitting into simple categories. And this shame shapes everything. It shapes what they allow themselves to express, what they allow themselves to need, what they allow themselves to be. Because being too much feels dangerous, feels like the thing that will push people away, feels like the fundamental flaw that makes them unlovable, and so they work to be less, to take up less space, to require less effort, to need less attention, to be less intense, less complicated, less deep. And in becoming less, they hope to become more acceptable, more lovable, more worthy of the connection they desperately want. But too much is not a real problem. It is a perception, a judgment, an assessment made by people who lack the capacity or willingness to understand complexity. And when someone tells you that you are too much, what they are really saying is you exceed my capacity. I cannot or will not do the work to understand you. And rather than acknowledge that as their limitation, they frame it as your flaw. They make it about you being too complicated, rather than them being too simple, too unwilling, too incapable of holding nuance, and you, having been told this repeatedly, by parents, by partners, by friends, internalize it. You believe them. You accept that the problem is you, that you are fundamentally too much, and you spend your life trying to fix this, trying to become less, trying to fit into the space others are willing to give you. Even when that space is too small, even when fitting into it requires cutting off essential parts of yourself, you do it anyway. Because being too much and alone feels worse than being less than you are and connected, or at least it did. until you realize that the connection was never real, that being loved for a simplified version is not actually being loved, that hiding yourself to maintain connection is just another form of being alone. This is not vanity. It is the internalized message from everyone who found them confusing, complicated, difficult. The message that said you would be lovable if you were less. And they believed it. Not because it was true, but because everyone said it. Parents who wanted an easy child, partners who wanted simple emotions, friends who wanted surface-level connection. All of them, in different ways, communicated the same thing. You are too much. And the person heard it, and internalized it, and spent their life trying to be less, trying to fit, trying to become the version that does not overwhelm. And in doing so, they lost themselves, not dramatically, not obviously, but slowly, gradually, over years, over decades, until one day they look in the mirror and do not recognize who is looking back, because the person looking back is a carefully constructed performance, a simplified version, a manageable version, a version built to be easy to love, but not a version that is actually them. There is also a specific relationship these individuals develop with explaining themselves. They over-explain, constantly, compulsively, exhaustingly. They cannot make a simple statement without qualifying it, cannot express a feeling without contextualizing it, cannot share an opinion without defending it. They layer explanation upon explanation, trying to preempt misunderstanding before it happens, trying to get ahead of the confusion they know is coming, trying to make their internal logic so clear that finally, someone will understand without twisting their words into something they did not mean. But the over-explaining rarely helps. More often, it creates the confusion it is trying to prevent. Because the problem is not lack of information. The problem is lack of willingness to understand. And no amount of explanation can compensate for unwillingness. But they keep trying. They keep over-explaining. Because somewhere inside they still believe that if they can just find the right words, the right examples, the right way of expressing themselves, the other person will understand. And if the other person understands, then maybe they will accept. Maybe they will not reduce. Maybe they will see the complexity and not recoil. And so they explain and explain and explain, and watch the other person's eyes glaze over, watch them get frustrated, watch them say quote 14 or quote 15, and the person feels the familiar shame, the shame of being too much, the shame of requiring too much explanation, the shame of not being simple enough to be easily grasped, and they apologize, again, for being complicated, for needing explanation, for not being someone who can express themselves simply. And the cycle continues. They over-explain. They get told they are being too much. They apologize. They try to simplify. They still get misunderstood. They try to explain again. And the exhaustion compounds. And the belief deepens. The belief that they are fundamentally difficult to understand. That something about them requires more effort than they are worth. Others experience this over-explaining as defensive, as complicated, as making simple things difficult. And in some ways, they are right. The person is making simple things complicated, but not by choice. They are making things complicated because simple expression has never led to accurate understanding. Because every time they tried to express something simply, it got misunderstood. A misunderstanding led to conflict, to rejection, to being told they were wrong about their own experience, And so they learned that simple expression is insufficient, that they need to provide context, need to explain their reasoning, need to justify their feelings, need to make it so clear that misunderstanding is impossible. But misunderstanding is never impossible, because the problem is not clarity of expression. The problem is that the other person is unwilling or unable to understand, and no amount of explanation compensates for that. But they do not realize this. Or if they realize it intellectually, they cannot accept it emotionally, because accepting it means accepting that they cannot control whether they are understood. That understanding requires willingness from the other person, and that willingness is not always present. And accepting that feels unbearable, so they keep trying, keep explaining, keep hoping that this time, with these words, finally they will be understood. Psychologically, this makes sense. If misunderstanding once meant rejection, then clarity becomes survival. But over-explaining often creates the confusion it is trying to prevent. Because the problem was never lack of explanation. It was lack of willingness to understand. And when someone is unwilling to understand, more words do not help. They just provide more material to misinterpret, more complexity to reduce, more nuance to simplify, and so the over-explaining backfires, creates the very misunderstanding it was designed to prevent, and the person is left feeling even more ununderstood, even more complicated, even more like the problem is them, like if they could just express themselves correctly, then understanding would happen. But expression is not the problem. Reception is, and they cannot control reception. They can only control expression, and so they keep working on expression, keep trying to find the magic combination of words that will finally make them understandable, not realizing that already understandable to people who want to understand. But to people who do not want to understand, no amount of clarity makes a difference. The problem was never them. It was always the unwillingness of others, but they carry the shame anyway, carry the belief that they are too complicated, and spend their lives trying to fix something that was never broken. Another area where the effects become visible is in how they process being seen. When someone sees them accurately, when someone understands them without extensive explanation, when someone grasps the complexity of who they are, they panic. Being seen accurately feels dangerous, feels exposing, feels like something bad is about to happen. Because being seen once meant being reduced, meant being misunderstood, meant being told that what they were showing was wrong or too much or unacceptable. And so even when someone sees them correctly, even when someone understands, the nervous system responds with alarm, with the expectation that understanding will be followed by rejection, that being seen clearly will reveal something unlovable, that accurate perception will lead to accurate judgment, and the judgment will be negative, because it always was. So they deflect, they change the subject, they minimize what was seen, they joke, they redirect attention, anything to avoid the discomfort of being understood. And this confuses people who are trying to connect, people who are offering understanding, people who are saying, I see you, and thinking that will be received as the gift it is. But it is not received as a gift, it is received as a threat. Because being seen to someone who is chronically misunderstood feels like being caught, like being found out, like the carefully constructed simplified version has slipped and the actual complicated version is visible. and visibility feels dangerous, feels like the moment before rejection, feels like the moment when the other person realizes, oh, you are actually more complicated than I thought, and then they leave, or reduce, or tell you to be simpler, and so being seen triggers the impulse to hide again, to reconstruct the simplified version, to make sure the full complexity is not visible, because full complexity, they learned, is not something people stay for. This creates a painful pattern in relationships. The person wants to be known, desperately. They want someone to see them accurately, to understand them fully, to appreciate their complexity rather than reduce it. But when someone offers this, when someone actually sees them, they push them away, not intentionally, not consciously, but through deflection, through minimization, through making themselves smaller again, through hiding the very thing that was just seen, and the person offering understanding feels confused, feels rejected, feels like their effort to know was unwanted, and they pull back, and the person who was being seen feels relief that the danger passed, that they successfully hid again, that the complexity was not fully exposed. But they also feel grief that once again being seen led to distance. Once again understanding was too threatening to accept. Once again they are alone, not because connection was not offered, but because accepting connection required staying visible, and staying visible feels impossible when visibility once meant misunderstanding and rejection. The push away is not personal, it is protective. It is the nervous system doing what it learned to do. Protect against the pain of being seen and then misunderstood. Protect against the vulnerability of being known and then rejected. Protect against the hope that this time this person might be different. Because hope, when disappointed, hurts more than never hoping at all. And so they protect, they push away, they hide, and they remain unknown, not because they want to be, but because being known feels more dangerous than being hidden, and so they choose hidden, again and again, with person after person, until being hidden feels permanent, until being unknown feels like identity, until they forget there was ever a version of themselves that wanted to be seen, because that wanting became too painful to hold, and so they buried it, and built a life around never being fully known, and told themselves it was fine, that partial connection was enough, that being loved for a simplified version was better than not being loved at all, even though deep down they knew it was not. Even though deep down they remained desperately, achingly lonely. This is not fear of intimacy in the general sense. It is fear of being known. Because being known once meant being reduced, simplified, or rejected. And the body remembers what the mind wants to forget. It remembers the parent who said, quote, 16, quote. It remembers the partner who said, quote, 17, quote. It remembers the friend who said, quote, 18, quote. It remembers every time accurate seeing was followed by inaccurate judgment. And it protects. It stays alert. It makes sure that full visibility does not happen again. Because full visibility once led to pain. And the nervous system's job is to prevent pain. Even when preventing pain also prevents connection, even when the protection keeps you safe but also keeps you alone, the nervous system does not care about connection, it cares about survival, and it learned that being seen is not safe, and so it keeps you hidden, whether you want to be or not. Another deep imprint shows up in their relationship with their own complexity. They apologize for it. treat it as a burden, feel guilty for having depth, for being multifaceted, for not fitting into simple categories, for having contradictory feelings, for being nuanced in a world that prefers simplicity. And this guilt shapes how they present themselves. They hide the contradictions. They simplify the nuance. They present themselves as more coherent, more consistent, more straightforward than they actually are. Because being complex, they learned, is inconvenient, is annoying, is something people tolerate rather than appreciate, and so they hide their complexity, apologize when it slips through, make themselves as simple as possible to make being with them as easy as possible. Because easy people are loved, and complicated people are tolerated, and they would rather be loved, even for a simplified version, than tolerated for being fully themselves. This shows up in language, in how they describe themselves. I know I am complicated, said with apology, with resignation, with the expectation that complicated is a flaw, something to be overcome, something to be fixed. They envy people who seem simple, people who have clear emotions, consistent opinions, straightforward preferences, people who do not contradict themselves, who do not hold multiple truths at once, who do not struggle to explain themselves because their internal experience matches what others expect. And this envy is painful, because it is not just about wishing life were easier, it is about wishing they were different, wishing they were someone they are not, wishing they could simply stop being complex and become simple. But complexity is not a choice. It is not something you can decide to stop. It is how their mind works, how they process experience, how they hold reality. And wishing it away is like wishing to be someone else entirely. But they do it anyway, because being themselves has not led to being loved, and being simple seems like the path to being lovable, even though becoming simple would require erasing essential parts of who they are. The internalized message is clear: complexity is a flaw, and if you want to be loved, you must minimize it. You must hide it. You must apologize for it. You must make yourself as simple as possible, so that being with you requires minimum effort, and they comply. They work on simplicity. They practice presenting themselves in ways that are easy to grasp. They hide the parts that are confusing, the parts that contradict, the parts that require explanation. And in hiding these parts, they hide themselves. Because the complexity is not separate from who they are. It is who they are, and hiding it means hiding themselves. But they do it anyway. Because the alternative, being complex and alone, feels worse than being simplified and connected. At least that is what they tell themselves, until one day they realize that simplified connection is not really connection, that being loved for who you are not is not really being loved, that hiding yourself to maintain relationship is just another way of being alone. But by the time they realize this, the pattern is so ingrained that changing it feels impossible, and so they continue, apologizing for being complex, wishing they were simple, and never quite understanding that complexity is not a flaw, it is just who they are, and who they are deserves to be loved without apology. From a psychological standpoint, this makes sense. If being complex once made you unlovable, then simplicity becomes the goal. But you cannot simplify a complex person. You can only teach them to hide their complexity, and hiding is not the same as being simple. Hiding is performance, is constant effort, is exhausting. Simple people are not working to be simple, they just are. But complex people pretending to be simple are working constantly, monitoring, editing, suppressing, and this work is invisible to others. Others see the simplified version and think, "See, you can be simple when you try," not realizing that the simplicity is a performance, that underneath the performance is the complexity that was always there, that never left, that was just hidden. And the person hiding knows this, knows they are performing, knows the simplicity is not real, but they maintain it anyway, because real simplicity was never an option, and hiding complexity is the only way they know to be loved. Even though what is being loved is not them, it is the performance, the mask, the simplified version they learn to present, and the real them, the complex them, remains hidden, unloved, unknown, waiting for the moment when being themselves might finally be safe. But that moment never comes, because they never risk it, never let the full complexity show, never give anyone the chance to love them as they actually are, because the fear of rejection is stronger than the desire to be known, and so they stay hidden and alone, even when surrounded by people who claim to love them. There is also a specific type of loneliness that comes from loving someone who does not understand you. It is not the loneliness of being alone. It is the loneliness of being with someone while feeling completely unknown. The loneliness of performing a version of yourself and watching them love that version while you remain unseen. The loneliness of being physically present but emotionally isolated. Of being in relationship but not truly connected. Of being loved in theory but not in reality. This loneliness is harder than being alone, because being alone, you know why you are lonely. You are by yourself. There is no one there. The reason is clear. But being lonely while being with someone, being lonely in relationship, creates a specific kind of confusion, a specific kind of pain. Because the relationship should solve the loneliness. The person is there. They say they love you, they show up, they are present, and yet the loneliness remains because what they love is not you. What they love is the version you perform, the simplified version, the translated version, the version you learn to present because the actual you was too much for them to handle, and so you are there, physically, but you are not really there, because the real you is hidden, protected, kept safe from the misunderstanding that would come if you revealed yourself fully, and they are there, and they think they know you, think they love you, think the relationship is real, but you know it is not. You know they love a version that does not exist. You know they are in love with the performance, and this creates a specific kind of heartbreak. The heartbreak of watching someone claim to love you while being completely wrong about who you are. The heartbreak of being described inaccurately, of watching them tell others about you and getting everything wrong, of hearing them say, "You are like this," when you're actually like that, and having to nod, having to agree, having to maintain the performance, because correcting them would reveal the gap, would reveal that who they think they love is not who you are, and revealing that feels more dangerous than maintaining the lie. This loneliness shows up in specific moments. The moment they describe you to someone else, and everything they say is wrong. The moment they make an assumption about what you like or want or need, and the assumption is completely inaccurate. The moment they comfort you in a way that shows they do not understand what you are actually upset about. The moment they praise you for something that is not you. The moment they criticize you for something that is also not you. All of these moments reveal the same thing. They do not know you. They know a version, a projection, a simplified caricature of who you actually are, and they love that version. And you watch them love that version, and you feel simultaneously grateful and devastated. Grateful because at least someone is claiming to love you. Devastated because what is being loved is not actually you. And so the love, however genuine it feels from their side, feels hollow from yours, feels incomplete, feels like being alone while someone stands right next to you telling you that you're not alone. But you are. You are desperately, achingly, profoundly alone. Because being with someone who does not know you is lonelier than being with no one at all. The grief of this is hard to name, hard to explain. Because how do you explain to someone that you are lonely in the relationship? How do you say, "You do not know me," without it sounding like blame? How do you articulate that the love they offer, however genuine, does not reach you because it is directed at someone who does not exist? You cannot. Or you try and they do not understand. They say, "But I do know you," and list things about you. Surface things, factual things. Things that are true but do not capture who you are. And you realize that trying to explain will only make it worse. Will only create conflict, will only hurt them without solving the problem, because the problem is not that they are not trying. The problem is that they are incapable or unwilling, and either way the result is the same. You are unseen, unknown, unloved in the way you need to be loved, and so you stop trying to explain. You accept the loneliness. You tell yourself it is fine. That partial love is better than no love, that being known partially is better than being known not at all, but deep down, you know it is not fine. Deep down, the loneliness is eating you alive. Deep down, you are disappearing, not because they are taking you away, but because you are hiding yourself, piece by piece, day by day. Until so little of the real you remains that you are not sure there is anything left to know. This is not paranoia, it is accurate perception. When someone consistently misunderstands you, when they love a version that is not real, you are lonely, not because they are absent, but because you are. You are absent from the relationship, hiding, performing, presenting a version they can love while keeping the real version protected. And this absence creates loneliness. The loneliness of being unknown, the loneliness of being misrepresented, the loneliness of watching someone claim intimacy while having no idea who you actually are. And this loneliness is valid, is real, is not something you're imagining or creating through negativity. It is the natural result of being in relationship with someone who does not see you. And being unseen, even by someone who loves you, is one of the loneliest experiences possible, because it means you are alone even when you are not alone, isolated even when you are connected, unknown even when you are in relationship. And that is not intimacy. That is just shared space with someone who does not actually know who they are sharing it with. Another subtle but powerful effect is how they relate to their own emotions. They doubt them constantly. They second guess what they feel. Wonder if they are overreacting. Wonder if they are misinterpreting their own experience. Wonder if maybe they are wrong about how they feel and everyone else is right. This self-doubt is not natural. It is learned. It is the result of years of being told that their emotional reality is inaccurate, that what they feel is not what is actually happening, that their perception of their own experience is wrong. And when you are told this repeatedly, by parents, by partners, by friends, you start to believe it. You start to doubt yourself. Start to trust others' assessment of your internal state more than your own experience of it. And this creates a profound disconnection from yourself, from your emotions, from your reality. Because if you cannot trust your own experience, what can you trust? This shows up in specific ways. Someone says, quote, "Want you 24?" and they question whether they are actually upset. Someone says again, quote, "25, Ryerson," and they wonder if their reaction is too big. Someone says, quote, "26, and they apologize for feeling what they feel. And over time, this external invalidation becomes internal doubt. They do not need others to question their emotions anymore. They do it themselves, automatically, reflexively. Any emotion that arises is immediately questioned. Is this real? Is this too much? Am I making this bigger than it is? Should I feel this? And the questioning prevents the feeling, prevents the authentic experience from being acknowledged. Because if you are constantly doubting whether what you feel is legitimate, you never actually feel it. You're too busy evaluating it, judging it, wondering if it is acceptable. And this evaluation, this constant internal monitoring, creates distance from your own experience, creates a gap between what is happening inside you and what you allow yourself to acknowledge. And this gap grows over time, over years, until you are so disconnected from your own emotions that you genuinely do not know what you feel. You know what others tell you that you feel, but what you actually feel is uncertain, questionable, possibly wrong. This is particularly painful because emotions are meant to be internal guides. They are meant to provide information about your experience, about what matters to you, about what needs attention. But when your emotions are constantly doubted, constantly questioned, constantly told they are inaccurate, you lose access to this guidance. You lose trust in your own internal compass. And without that trust, you become dependent on others, on their assessment of what you should feel, on their permission for what is acceptable to feel. And this dependency is exhausting, is disorienting, is destabilizing, because you are living your life, but you are not the authority on your own experience. Others are. And when others get to decide what you feel, you lose yourself. You become whoever they say you are. Feel whatever they say you should feel. And the real you, with real feelings, real reactions, real emotional depth, disappears. Not because it is not there, but because it is not allowed, not validated, not trusted, and so it goes underground, hidden, suppressed, waiting for the safety that might allow it to resurface, but that safety rarely comes, because you learned that your emotions are not trustworthy, and learning to trust them again requires something you do not know how to do. It requires trusting yourself more than you trust others, and that feels impossible when others' perception has been deemed more accurate than your own experience. Psychologically, this is the mind trying to reconcile two contradictory realities. My internal experience says one thing, everyone else says another, and when forced to choose, they often choose others' perception. Because being wrong about yourself is less lonely than being right and completely alone in that rightness. If you trust your own experience and everyone else says you are wrong, you are isolated in your reality. You are the only one who believes your feelings are real, and that isolation is unbearable. So you doubt yourself instead. You agree with their assessment. You decide that maybe they are right. Maybe you are not really feeling what you think you're feeling. Maybe your perception is off. Maybe you're too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. And agreeing with them brings relief. Brief relief. Because it allows connection. Allows you to be on the same page as others. Allows you to not be isolated in your own reality. But the relief is temporary. Because underneath, you know what you feel. You know your experience is real. You know they are wrong. But you suppress that knowing because the alternative, insisting on your own reality against everyone else's perception, feels too lonely, too isolating, too much. And so you doubt, and you suppress, and you become disconnected from yourself. And the disconnection becomes normal, becomes the price you pay for not being completely alone in your reality. Even though the disconnection is its own form of alone, its own form of isolation, its own form of being unseen. Another lasting imprint shows up in how they handle being corrected about themselves. When someone tells them how they feel, they accept it. When someone tells them who they are, they believe it. The inability to assert their own self-knowledge becomes automatic. Someone says, "You're not really upset, you're just tired," and they agree. Someone says, "You do not really want that, you're just being impulsive," and they accept it. Someone says, "You are not that kind of person," and they adjust their behavior to match. And this external definition of self becomes more powerful than internal knowing, because internal knowing was trained to doubt itself, was taught that it is inaccurate, was told repeatedly that what you think about yourself is less reliable than what others observe about you. And so external perception becomes authority, becomes more real than your own experience, and you lose the ability to say, "No, that is not how I feel," or "No, that is not who I am." You lose the ability to assert your own reality against someone else's assessment. And this loss is profound, because if you cannot be the authority on yourself, you are not autonomous. You are a reflection of others' perceptions, a collection of their projections, not a person with your own reality, just a mirror reflecting back what others decide you are. This happens in small moments. Someone says you are fine when you're not fine. And instead of correcting them, you agree. Someone assumes your motivation and gets it completely wrong. And instead of explaining what actually motivated you, you accept their narrative. Someone describes you in a way that does not fit. And instead of saying, "That is not accurate," you nod. You go along with it. You let them define you, not because you want to, but because correcting them feels impossible, feels like too much work, feels like creating conflict, feels like being difficult. And you learned that being difficult means being alone. So you let it go. You let them be wrong. You accept the incorrect definition, and in accepting it repeatedly, over time it starts to feel true, starts to replace your actual self-knowledge, starts to become how you see yourself, not because it is accurate, but because it is what you have been told so often that your own knowing gets overridden, gets drowned out, gets replaced by the collective perception others have imposed on you, and so you become who they say you are, not who you actually are. You behave in ways that match their expectations. You feel things they tell you that you feel. You want things they decide you want. And the real you, the you who knows your own experience, your own desires, your own reality, gets smaller and smaller. until you genuinely do not know who you are separate from who they say you are. And this is not confusion, it is erasure, slow erasure, gradual erasure, consensual erasure, in a sense, because you participated, you agreed, you went along with it. But you did not have a choice, not really, because asserting your own reality against their perception required a strength you did not have, required self-trust you were never taught to develop, required believing that your experience is more real than their observation, and you could not believe that, because believing that would mean everyone else is wrong, and everyone else being wrong feels less likely than you being wrong, so you accept being wrong about yourself, and you let them define you, and you lose yourself in the process. But at least you are not alone in your wrongness. At least you have connection, however hollow. At least someone claims to know you, however inaccurately, and that feels better than being right about yourself and completely isolated in that rightness. This is not weakness. It is the result of a lifetime of being told your self-perception is wrong. When everyone says you are X and you feel like Y, eventually you stop trusting Y. You start believing you simply do not know yourself as well as they do, and you defer to their judgment. You accept their definitions. You become who they say you are, not who you actually are, but who they need you to be, who they can understand, who fits their expectations. And in becoming that version, you disappear, not physically, but psychologically, authentically. You become a performance, a reflection, a projection, not a person. And this loss of self is gradual enough that you do not notice it happening. You do not wake up one day and realize you have disappeared. It happens slowly, over years, through thousands of small moments where you accepted their definition over your own knowing. And by the time you realize what happened, you're so far from yourself that finding your way back feels impossible. And so you stay in the performed version, in the defined by others version, in the version that is not you, but is at least something. Because being something inauthentic feels safer than risking being nothing at all. From a neurological standpoint, the brain struggles when internal and external realities conflict. When what you experience internally does not match what others tell you that you are experiencing, the brain experiences stress, cognitive dissonance, a pressure to resolve the contradiction, to make the internal and external match. And the brain has options for how to resolve this. It can trust internal experience and reject external feedback, or it can trust external feedback and doubt internal experience. And for someone who has been chronically misunderstood, for someone whose internal experience has been repeatedly invalidated, the brain learns to choose the second option. It learns to doubt itself, to defer to external perception, to treat internal experience as unreliable. And this learning has neurological consequences. It weakens the neural pathways associated with self-trust, with internal knowing, with confidence in your own perception, and it strengthens the pathways associated with external validation, with looking outside yourself for confirmation of reality, with needing others to tell you what is true. Over time, this creates a brain that is wired to doubt itself, that automatically questions internal experience, that reflexively seeks external confirmation before accepting anything as real. And this wiring is not easy to change, because it was built over years, through repeated experiences where internal knowing was invalidated and external perception was affirmed. And changing it requires something difficult, It requires the brain to unlearn the patterns that kept it safe, that prevented the cognitive dissonance, that allowed connection, however incomplete. And relearning to trust internal experience feels risky, feels like choosing isolation, feels like rejecting the feedback of everyone around you in favor of your own perception. And the brain resists this, resists because it learned that internal perception is unreliable, that trusting it leads to conflict, that believing your own experience creates disconnection. And so, even when you intellectually understand that you should trust yourself, even when you consciously want to reclaim authority over your own experience, the brain pulls you back, pulls you toward doubt, toward external validation, toward letting others define reality, because that is what it learned to do. And unlearning is slow, is difficult, is uncomfortable, but necessary if you ever want to know yourself again. The nervous system is not being dramatic. It is responding to genuine threat. The threat that your own experience is invalid, that your internal world is wrong, that who you are is fundamentally unacceptable, and that threat is real, not imagined, not exaggerated, real, because you were told repeatedly that who you are is not accurate, that how you feel is not correct, that what you perceive is not real. And when that message comes from everyone, from parents, from partners, from friends, the nervous system learns that your experience is dangerous, that trusting it leads to isolation, that believing it creates conflict, and so it stops trusting, stops believing, starts looking outside for confirmation of what is real. And this external dependency becomes wired in, becomes automatic, becomes the only way the nervous system knows how to navigate reality. And breaking this pattern requires something radical. It requires telling the nervous system that internal experience is trustworthy, that what you feel is real, that your perception is valid even when no one else agrees, and this message has to be repeated over and over, thousands of times, until the nervous system begins to believe it, until the old wiring weakens and new wiring forms, until trusting yourself becomes as automatic as doubting yourself once was. But this process is slow and uncomfortable, and requires sitting with the cognitive dissonance, the internal-external mismatch, without immediately resolving it by doubting yourself. And that discomfort, that unresolved tension, is what makes the change so difficult, but possible. There is also a specific relationship these individuals develop with authenticity. Authenticity becomes performance, not genuine expression, but something they are always on for, always managing, always calculating. They are never not monitoring how they are being perceived, never not editing what they say, never not translating what they feel into acceptable expression. And this constant management is exhausting, is depleting, is unsustainable, but they do not know another way. Because letting down the management, letting down the performance, letting down the monitoring means being themselves. And being themselves once led to misunderstanding. And misunderstanding felt like rejection. So the performance continues day after day, year after year, until the performance feels more real than anything underneath it, until they genuinely do not know who they are when they are not performing, until the question, "Who am I when no one is watching?" has no answer. Because they are always watching themselves, always managing, always performing, and the authentic self, if it ever existed, has been buried so deep that finding it feels impossible. This shows up in the inability to rest, Real rest requires letting down the vigilance, letting down the monitoring, letting down the performance, but they cannot, because the performance is protection, and letting it down feels dangerous, feels like inviting misunderstanding, feels like risking being seen accurately and having that accuracy be rejected, so they stay on, stay vigilant, stay performing, even in moments that should feel safe, even with people who claim to love them, even when alone. Because the performance is so ingrained that turning it off is no longer an option. It is not a conscious choice they are making. It is an automatic response, a survival mechanism that is always running, always active, always protecting them from being fully known. And the cost of this protection is exhaustion, is burnout, is the gradual erosion of any sense of authentic self. Because when you are always performing, always managing, always monitoring, you lose track of who you are beneath the performance, and eventually there is no beneath, there is just the performance, and the person you were, or could have been, is gone, hidden so well that even you cannot find them anymore. The question, who am I when no one is watching, is painful. Because when no one is watching, they are still performing, still monitoring, still managing. Because the watching is internal now. They are watching themselves, judging themselves, making sure that even in private they are being acceptable, being simple, being manageable. And this internal surveillance is constant, is unrelenting, is exhausting, and it prevents any authentic engagement with self, any genuine exploration of who they are, any honest acknowledgement of what they actually feel, want, need. Because honesty requires dropping the surveillance, and dropping the surveillance feels impossible, feels like losing control, feels like inviting chaos, and so they continue, watching themselves, performing for themselves, managing themselves, even when no one else is present, and this is loneliness at its most profound. Because you cannot even be yourself with yourself. Even in privacy you are performing, even alone you are hidden, even with no one watching you are not authentic, and that is not living, that is just surviving, in a prison of your own construction, behind walls you built to protect yourself, but the walls that protect also isolate, and you are alone, profoundly, completely, devastatingly alone, even when you are with yourself, because yourself is hidden, and you do not know how to find them anymore. This is not inauthenticity by choice, it is survival through adaptation. When being yourself meant being misunderstood, you learned to be someone else. And you got so good at it that eventually you forgot there was anyone else to be. You forgot that the performance was a performance. It became you. Or at least it became the only you that you know how to access. And the real you, if there ever was one, is buried, deep, so deep that excavating it feels like creating someone new rather than uncovering someone old. And that is disorienting, is frightening, is overwhelming, because you do not know who you will find if you dig beneath the performance. You do not know if there is anyone there at all, or if the performance is all that is left. And that uncertainty, that fear that you have erased yourself completely, keeps you in the performance, keeps you performing, keeps you hiding. Because at least the performed version is something. At least it is knowable. At least it exists. And risking that for the possibility of finding your authentic self feels too dangerous when you're not sure there is an authentic self left to find. And so you stay in the performance, safe, protected, hidden and alone, always alone. even when surrounded by people who claim to love you, because what they love is the performance, and the real you, if it still exists, has never been loved, has never been seen, has never been known, and maybe never will be. Another area where this psychology becomes visible is in romantic relationships. They often choose partners who also do not understand them, not consciously, not deliberately. But the pattern repeats. They find themselves with people who misinterpret them, who reduce them, who love simplified versions rather than complex reality. And there is comfort in this, strange comfort, because being misunderstood is familiar. It is what they know. It is the relational pattern they learned in childhood and have been repeating ever since. And familiarity, even painful familiarity, feels safer than the unknown, feels more like home than genuine understanding does, because genuine understanding is disorienting, is unfamiliar, is suspicious. When someone understands them without extensive explanation, they do not feel relief. They feel uncomfortable. They feel exposed. They feel like something is wrong, because understanding, in their experience, didn't happen naturally. It required work, explanation, translation. And when someone grasps them easily, when someone sees them without needing the performance, it triggers alarm. Triggers the question, what do they want? Why are they pretending to understand? What is the catch? Because easy understanding was never real. It was always followed by reduction, by simplification, by being told that actually they did not understand correctly after all. So they avoid people who understand them, or they push those people away, and they gravitate toward people who misunderstand them, people who need extensive explanation, people who require translation, people who reduce them to manageable versions. And this feels normal, feels like what relationships are supposed to be, feels like love. Because love, in their experience, always came with misunderstanding. Love always required performance. Love always meant hiding essential parts of yourself to maintain connection. And when someone offers love without requiring performance, when someone wants to know them fully, complexity and all, they do not trust it. They do not believe it. They push it away. Because that kind of love feels foreign, feels wrong, feels dangerous, and familiar misunderstanding feels safe, feels right, feels like home, even though home was lonely, even though home required constant hiding, even though home meant never being known. It is still home, and leaving home, even for something better, requires courage they are not sure they have. There is also hope driving this pattern, the hope that maybe this time with this person they can make someone understand. Maybe this time, if they explain correctly, translate accurately, perform perfectly, finally they will be seen. Finally, they will be known. Finally, the misunderstanding will resolve and the person will say, "Oh, now I see you. Now I understand. Now I know who you actually are." And this hope keeps them trying, keeps them explaining, keeps them in relationships with people who fundamentally cannot or will not understand them. Because giving up on the hope feels like giving up on being loved. And they cannot do that, cannot accept that maybe understanding is not possible with this person, cannot accept that maybe they chose wrong, cannot accept that maybe they are recreating a childhood pattern rather than healing it, and so they stay. They keep trying, they keep hoping, they keep believing that if they just work hard enough, eventually they will be understood. And the years pass, and the misunderstanding continues. and the loneliness deepens, and they still stay. Because leaving would mean accepting that understanding is not going to happen, that the love they are receiving is incomplete, that they chose someone who is incapable of knowing them, and accepting that feels like failure, feels like proof that they are too complicated to be understood by anyone, and so they stay, and they try, and they hope, and they remain unknown, year after year, in relationship after relationship, choosing people who cannot see them, and hoping that this time will be different, even though it never is. Psychologically, this makes sense. The nervous system recognizes the feeling of being misunderstood and mistakes familiarity for love. Being seen accurately feels foreign, uncomfortable, sometimes even threatening. But being misunderstood feels like home, feels like what they know, feels like the relational dynamic they were trained for, and so they choose it, again and again, not because they enjoy being misunderstood, but because familiarity feels safer than accuracy, because known pain feels more manageable than unknown love, because being misunderstood by someone who says they love you feels more trustworthy than being understood by someone you just met. And so the pattern repeats. They choose people who do not see them. They perform for those people. They exhaust themselves translating. And they call it love. They call it relationship. They call it connection. Even though they are profoundly alone. Even though they are never known. Even though the relationship is built on a performance rather than reality. They accept it. Because accepting it feels less painful than being alone. Or at least that is what they tell themselves, until one day they realize that they are alone anyway. That being in relationship with someone who does not know you is just another form of being alone. And maybe, possibly, it would be less lonely to be alone for real than to be alone while pretending to be connected. From a psychological standpoint, there is also a specific type of grief that surfaces later in life. Not the grief of a specific loss, not the grief of a relationship ending, but a more diffuse grief, a grief of absence, the grief of never being understood, the grief of never being seen accurately, the grief of spending years in relationships where you performed rather than participated, the grief of being loved wrong, of having people claim to know you while getting everything about you incorrect. This grief is hard to name, hard to explain, hard to process. Because how do you grieve something that never happened? How do you mourn the absence of understanding when most people do not even realize understanding was absent? How do you explain that you are grieving never being known when people will say, "But they loved you, isn't that enough?" And the answer is no, it is not enough. Love without understanding is hollow, is incomplete, is painful. And being loved by someone who does not know you is its own kind of loss, its own kind of grief, its own kind of absence. This grief shows up quietly, often without clear trigger. It surfaces as heaviness, as sadness that has no obvious source, as tears that appear when nothing specifically sad has happened. And the person feels confused. Why am I crying? Why am I sad? Nothing is wrong, but something is wrong. Something has always been wrong. You were never known, never fully seen, never accurately understood. And that loss, that absence, that gap between who you are and who people thought you were is real, is significant, is worthy of grief. Even if the relationship is still present, even if the person is still there, even if they still say they love you, you can grieve being unknown while being loved. You can mourn the understanding that never came while being in a relationship. You can feel the loss while still being connected. Because the loss is not about presence, it is about accuracy, about being seen, about being known, and you are not. And that is worth grieving, is worth acknowledging, is worth honouring with the sadness it deserves. The triggers for this grief are often simple. You see someone being understood easily. You watch a couple where one person explains something, the other just gets it, without extensive explanation, without translation, without performance. They just get it. And you realize you never had that. You realize every relationship you have had required work, required explanation, required you to make yourself simple enough to be grasped. And you feel the grief of what you never experienced, the grief of what was withheld, the grief of a fundamental human need that was never met, the need to be seen, to be known, to be understood without having to work for it. And this grief is legitimate, is real, is not self-pity, is not overdramatic, is the appropriate response to a lifetime of being misunderstood, to a lifetime of loving people who could not or would not see you accurate, to a lifetime of performing to maintain connection. And that grief deserves space, deserves time, deserves to be felt fully, not rushed through, not minimized, not explained away with, at least they tried, or at least they loved you. Because trying is not the same as succeeding, and being loved incorrectly is not the same as being loved fully. And you deserve to grieve that gap, that absence, that loss of something you never had. This grief is not self-pity, it is recognition. The recognition that you spent years loving someone who never knew you, that you were there, fully present, while they loved a version that didn't exist. And that loss is real. That grief is legitimate. It is the grief of relational absence, the grief of being with someone while being unseen, the grief of being loved for who you are not. And this grief, while painful, is also necessary, because you cannot heal what you do not acknowledge, cannot move forward if you pretend the loss did not happen, cannot build genuine connection if you are still carrying the unprocessed grief of never having had it. So the grief must be felt, must be honoured, must be given the space and time it needs to move through you, not forever, not as a permanent state, but as a necessary part of healing, a necessary acknowledgement of what was absent, so that you can eventually move toward what is possible, toward relationships where understanding is present, where being seen is real, where love is based on knowing rather than projection. But you cannot get there if you skip the grief, if you pretend it does not matter, if you minimize the loss. The grief is the bridge between what was and what could be, and crossing it requires feeling it, fully, honestly, without apology. But here is the part most people miss about those who were never understood. They did not just lose something, they also developed something. Through all the misunderstanding, all the performance, all the constant translation, they built capacities that many people never develop. They learned deep self-reflection. They learned to examine their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own motivations with extraordinary detail. Because if no one else was going to understand them, they had to understand themselves. They had to be able to articulate their internal experience with precision. They had to know themselves well enough to explain themselves to others. And this led to a level of self-awareness that is rare, that is valuable, that is profound, They became people who know their own minds, who can track their own emotional patterns, who understand their own complexity. And this understanding, while born from necessity, is real, is a capacity, is a strength. They also developed the ability to see others clearly. When you are chronically misunderstood, when you know what it feels like to be reduced, to be simplified, to be projected upon, you become careful about doing that to others. You become someone who sees nuance, who holds complexity, who does not rush to simplify people into categories. You appreciate depth because you have depth. You value complexity because you are complex, and you do not do to others what was done to you. You do not reduce, you do not simplify, you do not project. You see people as they are, with all their contradictions, all their nuance, all their complexity, and you hold that, without needing it to be simple, without needing it to fit into easy categories. And this capacity to see others accurately, to hold complexity without reducing it, is rare, is valuable, is a profound gift, not just to others, but to yourself. Because learning to see others clearly helps you learn to see yourself clearly, helps you recognize that complexity is not a flaw, is not something to be ashamed of, is just the nature of being human. And allowing that in others helps you allow that in yourself. They also developed deep empathy for others who feel misunderstood. They recognize it immediately. The signs of someone who is performing, someone who is translating, someone who is hiding their complexity. They see it because they lived it. And when they see it, they offer something rare. They offer genuine curiosity, genuine willingness to understand, genuine effort to see beyond the performance, because they know what it feels like to never receive that, and they do not want anyone else to feel that way. And so they become people who actually listen, who ask questions instead of assuming, who hold space for complexity without requiring simplification, who appreciate depth without needing it to be easier. And this capacity to offer real understanding to others, even while they themselves have never received it, is extraordinary, is compassionate, is powerful, and it makes them people who change lives, who offer healing through the simple act of seeing people accurately, of understanding them fully, of appreciating their complexity rather than reducing it. But self-awareness without self-acceptance becomes self-criticism, and seeing others clearly while being unseen yourself becomes isolation. So the gifts are real, and so is the cost. The capacity they developed came at a price, the price of never being known themselves, the price of constant performance, the price of believing they were too complicated to be loved as they are. And honouring the gifts does not erase the cost, does not mean the pain was worth it, does not mean they should be grateful for the misunderstanding, because look what it created. The gifts are real, and the cost is real, and both can exist, both can matter, both can be acknowledged, without one negating the other. They became people with extraordinary capacity for self-reflection and empathy. And they also became people who hide themselves and doubt their own experience. Both are true, and healing requires holding both, honouring what was developed without romanticizing what was lost, appreciating the strength without minimizing the pain, recognizing the gifts without forgetting the cost, because both shaped who they became, and both deserve to be seen, just like they deserve to be seen, fully, accurately, complexly, and without apology. Healing for the person who was never understood does not mean becoming simple. It does not mean learning to express yourself in ways that are easier to grasp. It does not mean making yourself more palatable, more manageable, more acceptable. Healing means something else. It means unlearning the belief that you are too complicated. It means learning that being complex is not being broken. It means finding people who are willing to understand rather than expecting you to simplify. It means recognizing that the problem was never you. It was the unwillingness or incapacity of others. And while you cannot control their willingness, you can control who gets access to you, who gets your time, who gets your energy, who gets the privilege of knowing you. And healing means being selective, means choosing people who want to understand, who appreciate complexity, who do not need you to be simple in order to love you. This is not about finding someone who gets you perfectly. Perfect understanding is not the goal, is not realistic, is not required. Healing is about unlearning the belief that you are fundamentally unknowable, that you are too complicated for anyone to understand, that being yourself requires constant translation. You are not too complicated, you are just complex, and complex is normal, complex is human, complex is beautiful, and the right people will see that, will appreciate that, will want to know that, without requiring you to make it easier, without demanding simplification, without making you feel like your depth is a burden. The right people will ask questions, will be curious, will sit with complexity without needing immediate clarity, will hold contradictions without needing them resolved, will see you as you are and not need you to be something else. And these people exist. They are rare, but they exist. And healing means believing that you can be known, that understanding is possible, that someone somewhere is capable of seeing you fully and staying, not running, not reducing, not simplifying, just staying with you in your complexity, in your depth, in your full, authentic, multifaceted self. This is not about finding someone who gets you perfectly. It's about unlearning the belief that you're fundamentally unknowable, that you're too complicated, that being yourself requires translation. You're not too much. You just loved people who were unwilling to understand you, and their unwillingness was their limitation, not your flaw. And healing begins when you internalize that, when you stop believing that something about you is fundamentally wrong, when you start recognizing that what felt like your problem was actually their incapacity. And while that does not undo the pain, while that does not erase the years of hiding, it does change how you move forward. It changes who you choose. It changes what you accept. It changes what you believe is possible. And that change, that shift in belief, is everything. Because belief shapes behavior, and behavior shapes life. And believing that you can be known, that understanding is possible, that the right people will see you, changes everything about how you show up, how you relate, how you love, and who you allow to love you. One of the most important steps is learning to trust your own self-perception, learning that you know yourself better than others know you, that your internal experience is more accurate than their external observation, that when someone tells you who you are and it does not match who you feel you are, you get to say no. You get to correct them. You get to assert your own reality. This is not being defensive. This is not being difficult. This is reclaiming authority over yourself. This is saying, I am the expert on my own experience, not you, me. and your interpretation, however well-meaning, is wrong, and I will not accept it. And this assertion, this reclaiming of self-knowledge, is crucial, because you cannot heal while still accepting others' incorrect definitions. You cannot build authentic self while deferring to external perception. You cannot know yourself while trusting others' assessment more than your own experience. You have to trust yourself, have to believe your own knowing, have to assert your own reality, even when others disagree, even when others insist they know you better, even when others say you are wrong about yourself. This is difficult, because you were trained to doubt, were trained to defer, were trained to believe that external perception is more reliable than internal experience, and undoing that training requires practice, requires repeatedly choosing self-trust over external validation, requires saying no, that's not what I meant, without apologizing, requires correcting misperceptions without over-explaining, requires standing firm in your own knowing even when others push back, and this feels uncomfortable, feels risky, feels like you are being difficult, but you are not being difficult. You are being accurate. You are protecting your own reality from being overwritten by someone else's projection, and that protection is necessary, is crucial, is the foundation of healing, because if you cannot protect your own self-knowledge, if you continue to accept others' definitions, you will never know yourself. You will only know who others say you are, and that is not healing. That is continued erasure, continued hiding, continued performance, just in a slightly different form. This doesn't mean you're always right about yourself. It means you get to be the primary author of who you are. Not the only author, but the primary one. And that authority is yours to reclaim. It was taken from you. Through years of being told your self-perception was wrong, through years of having others define you, through years of accepting their assessment over your own knowing. But it is still yours. It always was. It was just suppressed, hidden, overridden, and now you are reclaiming it. You are saying my experience matters, my perception is valid, my reality is real, and no one gets to tell me otherwise. And this reclamation is empowering, is liberating, is the beginning of knowing yourself again, of trusting yourself again, of being yourself again. Not perfectly, not completely, but more than you have been, more than you were allowed to be. And that more, that expansion, that reclaiming of self is healing, is growth, is the foundation of everything else. Because you cannot build authentic life without authentic self, and you cannot have authentic self without trusting your own knowing. And trust begins with one small assertion, one small correction, one small moment where you say, no, that's not accurate, and mean it, and refuse to back down. And slowly, moment by moment, assertion by assertion, you rebuild trust in yourself. And that trust is everything. Another crucial step is learning to stop translating yourself, learning to express what you actually feel instead of the acceptable version. Learning to say, I am devastated instead of I am sad when devastated is accurate. Learning to express intensity without softening it, to express complexity without simplifying it, to express depth without reducing it. This is terrifying. Because untranslated expression was never safe, was never received well, was always met with discomfort, with judgment, with the message that you are too much. And so expressing authentically feels like inviting that same response, feels like setting yourself up for rejection, feels like choosing to be too much when you could choose to be manageable. But choosing to be manageable means choosing to remain hidden, means choosing performance over authenticity, means choosing connection based on lies over the possibility of connection based on truth. And while that might feel safer, it is not healing. It is maintaining the pattern. And healing requires breaking the pattern. Even when breaking it feels dangerous. This does not mean being gratuitously intense, does not mean overwhelming people unnecessarily, but it means not preemptively softening your expression just to make others comfortable. It means allowing your authentic feelings to be stated authentically, without immediate translation, without automatic reduction. If you are furious, saying you are furious. If you are devastated, saying you are devastated. If something is complicated, not pretending it is simple. And yes, some people will respond poorly. Some people will say you are too much. Some people will tell you to calm down. Some people will not be able to handle untranslated you. And that is information. That is data about who they are, about their capacity, about whether they are capable of being in relationship with the actual you. And it is better to know that early. Better to find out through authentic expression than through years of performance only to discover later that they never actually knew you. And never wanted to. The people who matter will stay, will appreciate authenticity even when it is complicated, will prefer complexity over simplicity if it means knowing you, will handle intensity because it is real, and the people who do not matter will leave, or judge, or tell you to be less. And those people leaving is not loss, it is clarification. It is discovering who is capable of being in your life and who is not. And that discovery, while painful, is necessary. Because you cannot build real relationships with people who cannot handle real you. And knowing who can handle it and who cannot saves you years of wasted time, years of performing, years of translating, years of hoping that someday they will understand when they never will. Better to know now, through authentic expression, than to discover later, after you have already given years to someone incapable of seeing you. Stopping the translation doesn't guarantee you'll be understood, but it guarantees you'll be authentic, and authenticity, even when misunderstood, is better than being accurately understood as someone you're not. Because being known incorrectly is not actually being known. It is being projected upon. And projection is not intimacy. Authenticity risks misunderstanding. But it also creates the possibility of genuine understanding, of being seen accurately, of being known truly. And that possibility only exists if you show yourself, if you stop translating, if you risk being too much in the hope that maybe, possibly, to the right person, you will be exactly enough. And that hope, that possibility, is worth the risk, is worth the discomfort, is worth the fear, because the alternative is spending your entire life hidden. And hidden is lonely, is exhausting, is not living. It is just surviving. And you deserve more than survival. You deserve to be known. And being known requires being seen. And being seen requires stopping the translation. And yes, it is scary, but it is also necessary, and possible, and worth it. There is also a specific healing that happens when you meet someone who understands you, when someone sees you without extensive explanation, when someone grasps your complexity without needing it simplified, when someone appreciates your depth without finding it burdensome. This experience is transformative, not because one person understanding you solves everything, but because it disproves the core belief The belief that you are fundamentally unknowable, the belief that you are too complicated to be understood, the belief that understanding requires translation. When someone understands you naturally, easily, without you having to work for it, everything shifts. You realize it is possible. You realize the problem was never you. You realize that being understood does not require becoming simple. It requires finding someone with capacity, with willingness, with curiosity. And when you find that person, when you experience being understood without effort, you cannot go back to believing you are too much. You cannot return to accepting translation as necessary. You cannot unsee the truth. That understanding is possible, that you are knowable, that complexity is not a barrier. It is just who you are, and who you are can be known by the right people, at the right time, without performance, without translation, without pretending to be simple, just as you are. But this experience also triggers discomfort. Because being understood is unfamiliar, the nervous system expects to perform, expects to translate, expects to manage perception. And when someone just gets you without that work, it is disorienting. It triggers suspicion. What do they want? Why are they pretending to understand? When will they reveal that they did not actually get it? The nervous system resists. Resists because understanding feels wrong. Feels like a trick. Feels like something bad is hiding beneath something good. And this resistance pushes away the very thing you need. Pushes away the person offering understanding. Pushes away the possibility of being known. And you have to override the resistance. Have to tell yourself that the discomfort is not danger. That unfamiliar is not threatening. That being understood can be safe. That this person is not everyone else. That maybe, possibly, they actually do get you. And that is okay. More than okay, it is healing. This often feels uncomfortable at first. Not because something is wrong, but because being understood accurately is unfamiliar. The nervous system expects to perform, to translate, to manage. And when someone just gets you without the work, it's disorienting, but it's also healing. It's the beginning of believing that understanding is possible, that you're not too complicated, that the right people will see you. And slowly, with repeated experiences of being understood, the belief shifts from quote 46 to quote 47, and that shift changes everything, changes who you choose, changes what you accept, changes what you believe is possible, and opens the door to relationships where being yourself is not only safe but valued, where complexity is appreciated, where depth is desired, where you do not have to hide, do not have to translate, do not have to perform. You can just be. And being is enough, more than enough. It is exactly what the right person wants. Your full, authentic, complicated, multifaceted self. And that acceptance, that appreciation, that understanding is not too much to ask for. It is the minimum. It is what you deserved all along, and what healing makes possible. Another essential part of healing is learning to be complex without apology. Learning that depth is not a flaw, that nuance is not a burden, that contradictions are not problems to be solved. Learning to say, quote 48 as statement of fact, not apology, as description, not confession, as reality, not shame. You're complicated, and that is okay. More than okay. It is who you are, and who you are does not require apology, does not require justification, does not require explanation. Beyond quote 49 simple people do not apologize for being simple, and complex people should not apologize for being complex. both are just different ways of being. Neither is better, neither is worse. They are just different. And your complexity is not less valid, less lovable, less worthy than someone else's simplicity. It is just different. And different is allowed. Different is acceptable. Different is fine. This requires releasing the internalized shame, the shame that says complexity is too much, that says being multifaceted is being difficult, that says depth is a burden. This shame is not yours. It was given to you by people who could not handle complexity, by people whose capacity was too small for your depth, by people who needed you to be simple, because simple was all they could manage, and you internalized their limitation as your flaw. You accepted their incapacity as your problem. You made their unwillingness your responsibility, and it is time to give it back. Time to say this shame is not mine. This judgment is not accurate. This assessment is not real. I am not too much. I am complex, and complex is not a problem. It is just who I am, and who I am is worthy, is valuable, is lovable, not despite complexity, not in spite of depth, but as I am, fully, completely, without apology. Owning your complexity doesn't mean being difficult. It means refusing to shrink, refusing to simplify, refusing to apologize for having depth. You are allowed to be multifaceted. You are allowed to contain contradictions. You are allowed to be more than one thing. And owning this, claiming this, refusing to apologize for this is powerful, is liberating, is healing. Because when you stop apologizing, you stop accepting the shame. And when you stop accepting the shame, you stop believing that complexity is a flaw. And when you stop believing it is a flaw, you stop trying to fix it. And when you stop trying to fix it, you start accepting it. And acceptance is the foundation of healing, is the beginning of being yourself without fear, is the opening to relationships where you do not have to hide. Because when you accept your complexity, when you own it, when you refuse to apologize for it, you attract different people. You attract people who appreciate complexity, who value depth, who want to know you fully, and you repel people who need simple, who require easy, who demand that you be manageable, and that repelling is good, is necessary, is protective, because those people were never going to love you. They were only going to love a version, and version is not enough. You deserve to be loved fully, complexly, accurately. And that begins with refusing to apologize for being who you are. From a neurological standpoint, the healing process requires rebuilding self-trust, requires teaching the brain to value internal signals more than external feedback, requires strengthening the neural pathways associated with self-knowledge and weakening the pathways associated with self-doubt. And this is slow work, is gradual work, is work that happens through repetition, through thousands of small moments where you choose to trust yourself over external perception, where you assert your own reality over someone else's assessment, where you believe your experience over someone else's interpretation. And each time you make that choice, you strengthen the pathway, make self-trust slightly more automatic, slightly more natural, slightly more accessible, and over time, months, years, the pathway becomes strong enough that trusting yourself becomes the default, becomes what you do automatically rather than what you have to consciously choose. But this requires patience, requires understanding that change is slow, that the brain was wired over years to doubt itself, and rewiring takes years too. And there will be setbacks, days when you doubt yourself automatically, days when external perception feels more real than internal experience, days when the old patterns reassert themselves and you feel like you have made no progress. But those days do not erase the progress that was made. They are just days, and progress is not linear, is not constant, is not obvious, but it is real, and it is happening, even on the days when it does not feel like it is. The work you are doing, the assertions you are making, the trust you are building, is changing your brain, is creating new pathways, is making new possibilities available, and that work matters, even when it feels slow, even when it feels insufficient, even when it feels like nothing is changing. Something is changing, something is building, something is healing. And trusting that process is part of the work, is part of the healing, is part of learning to trust yourself. Because if you cannot trust the process, cannot trust that the work is making a difference, cannot trust that healing is happening, then you are still not trusting, still not believing, still not letting go of doubt. And letting go of doubt is what this is all about. The mind can learn to trust itself again. But learning takes time. The brain spent years being taught that external perception is more accurate than internal experience. Teaching it to trust itself again is slow work, but necessary work, and possible work, and you are doing it. Every time you assert your reality, every time you correct a misperception, every time you trust your knowing over someone else's judgment, you are rewiring, you are healing, you are building the capacity to know yourself, to trust yourself, to be yourself. And that capacity is everything, is the foundation of authentic life, is the requirement for genuine connection, is the key to being known, and it is worth the slowness, worth the difficulty, worth the discomfort, because the alternative is living your entire life doubting yourself, and that is not living. That is just surviving, and you deserve more than survival. You deserve to trust yourself, you deserve to know yourself, you deserve to be yourself, fully, confidently, without doubt. And that is what you are building, slowly, gradually, but certainly. One moment at a time. One of the most healing experiences is choosing to be misunderstood rather than hide, choosing authenticity over acceptance, choosing being real over being liked. This is a radical choice, because it goes against everything you were taught. You were taught that being liked requires being acceptable, that being accepted requires being simple, that maintaining connection requires hiding complexity. And choosing to be authentic, choosing to be complex, choosing to be yourself, even when it means being misunderstood, feels like choosing isolation, feels like choosing to be alone. But it is not. It is choosing yourself. And choosing yourself is not the same as choosing isolation. It is choosing clarity, choosing integrity, choosing to know that any connection you have is based on reality rather than performance. And that is worth the risk, is worth the possibility of being misunderstood, is worth the chance that some people will not get you. Because the alternative is guaranteed disconnection, is guaranteed loneliness, is being with people who do not know you. And that is lonelier than being alone. That is more isolating than solitude. That is worse than being misunderstood. Because at least when you are misunderstood while being authentic, you know they are responding to the real you, not a performance, and their misunderstanding is information about them, not about you, about their capacity, not your worth. And that information is valuable, is clarifying, is protective, because it prevents you from wasting years with people incapable of seeing you. Choosing authenticity over understanding doesn't mean you don't want to be understood. It means you've decided that being real is more important than being correctly interpreted. And that decision, that choice, is where freedom begins. Freedom from performance, freedom from translation, freedom from hiding, freedom to be yourself, even when yourself is misunderstood, even when yourself is rejected, even when yourself is too much, because being yourself and being alone is better than hiding yourself and being connected. Being yourself and being misunderstood is better than translating yourself and being known incorrectly. Being yourself and being rejected is better than performing yourself and being accepted. Because the acceptance is not real if it is not for the real you. And you want real. You need real. You deserve real. And real requires authenticity, requires risk, requires choosing yourself, even when choosing yourself means some people will not choose you back. And that is okay. That is acceptable. That is fine. Because the people who leave were never going to love you anyway. They were only going to love the performance. And performance is exhausting and unsustainable and not worth it. And you are done performing. You are choosing authenticity. And authenticity, even when misunderstood, is freedom, is healing, is life. Another important part of healing is learning to set boundaries around being defined. Learning to say quote 50 when someone tells you who you are incorrectly. Learning to correct misperceptions without apologizing. Learning to assert your own reality against someone else's projection. This is not being defensive. This is protecting your right to define yourself. Your right to be the authority on your own experience. Your right to say, "You are wrong about me," without needing extensive justification. And this boundary setting is crucial, because without it, you continue to accept external definitions, continue to let others overwrite your reality, continue to defer to perceptions that are inaccurate, and that deferral, that acceptance, that passive allowance of being defined by others is what kept you hidden, what kept you performing, what kept you unknown. And healing requires stopping it. Requires saying no, that's not accurate when someone misunderstands. Requires saying no, that's not who I am when someone projects. Requires saying no, that's not what I meant when someone twists your words. And not apologizing for these corrections, not softening them, not over-explaining them, just stating them as fact, as reality, as the way things are. This feels uncomfortable, feels like conflict, feels like being difficult, but it is not. It is being accurate, is being honest, is protecting your reality from being erased, and that protection is not optional, is not something you can skip, is not something you can defer. It is required, is necessary, is the only way to maintain any sense of self in relationship. Because if you cannot assert who you are, if you cannot correct misperceptions, if you cannot defend your own reality, then who you are gets determined by others, gets shaped by their projections, gets overwritten by their assumptions, and you disappear, not dramatically, but slowly, gradually, until you are no longer yourself. You're just a collection of other people's perceptions, and that is not healing. That is erasure, and you are done being erased. You are setting boundaries, you are correcting, you are asserting, and you are not apologizing for it. Because your reality matters, your experience is valid, Your self-knowledge is accurate, and no one gets to tell you otherwise. Not anymore. Setting boundaries around definition doesn't mean being defensive. It means protecting your right to be the authority on yourself. You get to say who you are, not them. And enforcing that boundary is self-respect, is self-love, is self-preservation. And it is necessary, is crucial, is the foundation of knowing yourself. Because you cannot know yourself if everyone else is defining you. Cannot trust yourself if everyone else is telling you who you are. Cannot be yourself if yourself is determined by consensus rather than internal knowing. So you set boundaries, you correct, you assert, and you let people be uncomfortable with it. Because their comfort is not more important than your reality. Their ease is not more valuable than your truth. Their preference for you to be simple is not more significant than your need to be known accurately. And if they cannot handle your corrections, if they cannot accept your reality, if they insist on their misperception being more accurate than your experience, then they are not safe. And you do not need to maintain connection with people who are not safe. You need to protect yourself. And protection means boundaries. And boundaries mean saying no. And no is a complete sentence. And you are allowed to use it. Without apology, without guilt, without fear. You are allowed to define yourself and to reject anyone's attempt to define you differently. That is your right, and healing means claiming it. There is also a specific healing that comes from grieving the relationship as it was, from accepting that the person who loved you never actually knew you, from acknowledging that the relationship, however long, however significant, was based on partial knowing, was built on performance, was maintained through hiding, and that the love they offered, while maybe genuine from their side, never reached you, because it was directed at a version that did not exist, and grieving this is necessary, is painful, is complicated, because how do you grieve a relationship that is still present? How do you mourn being unknown by someone who claims to know you? How do you process the loss of something that never existed while maintaining connection with someone who does not realize it never existed? You cannot, or you can, but it requires honesty, requires saying, quote, 57, and that honesty might end the relationship, might create conflict, might hurt them, but it is still necessary, because you cannot heal while pretending, cannot move forward while maintaining the performance, cannot build real connection while hiding. So you grieve, you acknowledge, you say the truth, and you let the consequences unfold, and sometimes the consequences are painful, sometimes they leave, sometimes they get defensive, sometimes they insist they do know you and accuse you of changing, of being unfair, of rewriting history, and sometimes they are right. Maybe you did change. Maybe the you they knew was real at the time but is not who you are now. Or maybe they are wrong. Maybe they never knew you. Maybe everything was performance. Maybe you are not rewriting history but revealing it. And either way, the grief is real, is valid, is necessary. Because whether they knew you once or never knew you, the loss is real. The absence of being known is real. The years of performance are real. The hiding is real. The loneliness is real. And grieving it is the only way to release it, to move past it, to build something different going forward. So you grieve, not publicly, maybe, or publicly if that is what is needed. But you grieve, you allow the sadness, you honour the loss, You acknowledge what was absent, and you release the hope that it will somehow, retroactively, become present. You release the fantasy that they will suddenly understand, that they will say, quote 58, quote, that the relationship will transform into something real. You release that hope, and you grieve it, and you move forward into relationships that can be real, into connections that are based on knowing, into love that reaches you, because you are no longer hiding, and what is no longer hidden can finally be seen, and seen you can finally be known, and known you can finally be loved, actually, truly, fully, and that is worth the grief, worth the loss, worth the pain of releasing what never was. Grieving the misunderstood relationship doesn't mean the love wasn't real. It means accepting that the love was incomplete. They loved you, but they didn't know you, and that difference matters, and it deserves to be grieved, not with blame, not with anger, but with sadness, with acknowledgement, with the honest recognition that something essential was missing, that being loved by someone who does not know you is not the same as being loved by someone who does, and that you deserved the latter, and maybe you never got it, and that is worth mourning, is worth acknowledging, is worth honouring with the grief it deserves, not forever, not as a permanent state, but for as long as it takes to release it, to let it move through you, to allow the sadness to complete. And then, when the grief has been felt, when the loss has been acknowledged, when the absence has been honoured, you can move forward into something different, something better, something based on being known. And that possibility, that hope, that future is what the grief makes space for, is what the mourning allows, is what letting go creates, and it is worth it, worth the pain, worth the sadness, worth the grief, because what comes after is real, is genuine, is actually yours. Healing also requires releasing the fantasy that they will eventually understand, that one day they will see you clearly, that the misunderstanding will suddenly resolve and they will say, "Oh, now I understand, now I see you." This fantasy is comforting, keeps hope alive, keeps you connected to relationships that do not serve you, keeps you performing in the hope that eventually the performance will no longer be necessary. But the fantasy is not real, is not likely to become real, and holding on to it prevents healing, because healing requires accepting current reality, and current reality is that they do not understand, that they maybe cannot understand, that their capacity or their willingness is insufficient, and that waiting for them to change, waiting for them to develop capacity, waiting for them to suddenly see you, is wasting your life, is keeping you stuck in relationships that cannot provide what you need, is preventing you from seeking relationships that can. So the fantasy must be released, must be grieved, must be let go, not because you do not care, but because your life cannot wait for their understanding. Your healing cannot be contingent on their growth. Your wholeness cannot depend on their capacity. You must move forward without them, without their understanding, without the fantasy that someday they will get it. Because someday is not coming, and waiting for it is costing you your life. Releasing the fantasy is not giving up on them. It's giving up on the version of them that doesn't exist. The version that would suddenly see you clearly. The version that would understand. That version isn't coming, and your healing cannot wait for them. And letting go of this fantasy, letting go of this hope, is painful, is grief, is loss, because the fantasy protected you, gave you something to look forward to, gave you a reason to stay, gave you hope that the relationship could become what you needed, but it cannot, or at least it has not, and waiting longer will not change that. So you release, you let go, you accept that this is what the relationship is, incomplete, based on partial knowing, maintained through performance, and you decide whether that is enough, whether you can accept being partially known, whether you can live with being loved for a version rather than for yourself. And if the answer is no, you leave, or you stay but stop performing, and see what happens when the real you shows up. And maybe they adapt, maybe they surprise you, maybe they rise to meet you, or maybe they do not, maybe they cannot, maybe they leave, or you leave, because the relationship, as it was, is no longer acceptable, and change is required. And if change is not possible, ending is necessary. And that ending is grief, but it is also freedom. Freedom to be yourself. Freedom to seek relationships that can hold you. Freedom to be known. Finally, fully, actually. Another crucial element of healing is learning to seek people who are capable of understanding. Learning that not everyone can understand you. And that is okay. Not everyone needs to. You do not need universal understanding. You need selective understanding. You need a few people who get you, who appreciate complexity, who value depth, who ask questions instead of making assumptions, who are curious instead of judgmental, who want to know you fully instead of needing you to be simple. And these people exist. They are rare, but they exist. And healing means learning to identify them, learning to recognize capacity when you see it, learning to distinguish between people who cannot understand and people who will not, and choosing people who can, who will, who want to, and releasing people who do not. Capacity for complexity is visible. It shows up in how people talk about others. Do they reduce people to simple categories? Do they use black and white thinking? Do they need people to be consistent? Or do they hold nuance? Do they acknowledge contradictions? Do they allow people to be multifaceted? These are signs of capacity, of ability to hold complexity. And noticing these signs helps you choose wisely, helps you invest energy in people who can receive it, who can understand it, who can appreciate it, and helps you not waste time with people who cannot, who need simple, require easy, demand that you fit into their boxes. Those people are not bad. They are just not your people, not capable of knowing you, not capable of loving you fully. And that is information. And information is valuable because it allows choice, allows you to choose wisely, allows you to build relationships that can hold you, that can know you, that can love you, actually, truly, fully, and that is what you deserve. That is what healing makes possible. That is what choosing capable people creates. Choosing understanding people doesn't mean only connecting with people exactly like you. It means choosing people who are curious, who ask rather than assume, who can hold complexity, who want to know you, not just a version of you. And these people are gifts, are rare, are worth protecting, worth investing in, worth being vulnerable with, because they can handle vulnerability, can handle complexity, can handle you as you are, fully, without needing you to be less. And finding these people, connecting with these people, being known by these people, is healing, is transformative, is proof that understanding is possible, that you are not too complicated, that the right people will see you and stay and love you, not despite complexity, but including it, appreciating it, valuing it, and that experience, that reality, that love is everything, is what you were missing, is what you needed, is what healing has been moving you toward. And now that you know it is possible, now that you have experienced it, you cannot go back, cannot accept less, cannot settle for being partially known. You know what full knowing feels like, and that is what you deserve. That is what you will seek. That is what you will accept. Nothing less. Not anymore. From a psychological standpoint, healing is not about making yourself understandable to everyone. It is not about learning to explain yourself better. It is not about finding the right words that will finally make complex people grasp you. Healing is about accepting that some people will not understand you, and that is their limitation, not your flaw. Healing is about finding your people, the people who can understand, who want to understand, who appreciate what they discover when they do. And healing is about releasing everyone else, not with anger, not with judgment, but with acceptance. They are not capable of knowing you, and that is okay. They do not need to. Not everyone needs to understand you, just the right ones, just the people you allow into your life, just the people you choose. And that choice is yours, and making that choice consciously, deliberately, protectively, is healing, is growth, is reclaiming your life from people who could never fully see you. The goal is not universal understanding. The goal is selective connection. Connection with people who can hold you, who can know you, who can love you as you are. And finding those people requires being yourself, requires dropping the performance, requires risking being too much, because only by being yourself will the right people recognize you. Only by being complex will you attract people who appreciate complexity. Only by being authentic will you find people who value authenticity. And yes, you will lose people. People who needed you to be simple. People who required performance. People who loved the managed version. Those people will leave, or fade, or pull away. And that is okay. That is necessary. That is part of healing. Because making space for the right people requires releasing the wrong people, and the wrong people are anyone who cannot love the real you, anyone who needs you simplified, anyone who prefers the performance. Those people, however long they have been present, however much history you share, are not your people, and letting them go is not loss. It is clarity. It is making space. It is choosing yourself. And choosing yourself is always the right choice. The person who was never understood doesn't disappear when healing happens. They just stop believing they're fundamentally incomprehensible. They accept that some people won't understand, and they find the ones who will, and with those people, with the right people, they are known, fully, accurately, complexly, and that knowing is healing, is transformative, is everything. It does not erase the years of being misunderstood, does not undo the pain of being reduced, does not change what happened, but it changes what is possible. It changes the future. It opens doors that were previously closed, doors to connection, to being known, to being loved for who they actually are, not who they performed being. And walking through those doors is healing, is growth, is life, real life, authentic life, life where you can be yourself, where complexity is appreciated, where depth is valued, where being you is enough, more than enough. It is exactly what is wanted, and that reality, that possibility, that experience is what healing has been moving toward, and now it is here, available, real, and you are ready to be seen, to be known, to be loved as you are, fully, finally, completely. Healing looks different for everyone, but there are common elements. You express yourself without constant translation. You let people be wrong about you without immediate correction. You are not constantly over-explaining your thoughts, your feelings, your choices. You trust your own experience more than others' perception. You choose people who understand you without requiring simplification. You can be complex without apologizing. You have stopped performing, or at least you perform less. You catch yourself translating and stop. You notice when you are shrinking and choose to expand instead. You allow yourself to be too much for people who need less, and you do not feel guilty about it. You recognize that their limitation is not your problem, that their incapacity is not your flaw, that you are not responsible for making yourself digestible. You are responsible for being yourself, and you are, increasingly, imperfectly, but genuinely, and that is healing, that is progress, that is growth, that is freedom, and it feels different, lighter, more real, more alive, not perfect, not complete, but better, significantly better than hiding ever felt. Healing doesn't mean everyone understands you now. It means you've stopped requiring everyone to understand you. You've found the people who do, and you've made peace with the ones who don't, and that peace is not apathy, is not detachment, is not caring. It is acceptance. Acceptance that understanding requires capacity, and not everyone has it. And that is okay. That is reality. That is how humans work. Some people can hold complexity. Some cannot. Some people value depth. Some prefer surface. Some people want to know you fully. Some are satisfied with partial knowing. And you have learned to distinguish, have learned to identify, have learned to choose accordingly. And that choosing is healing, is protective, is wise, is the foundation of authentic connection. Because authentic connection requires people capable of knowing you, and you have found them, or you are finding them, or you will find them, because they exist. And you are no longer hiding, and what is not hidden can be seen, and seen you can be known, and known you can be loved, actually, truly, fully. And that is not too much to ask for. That is what you deserved all along, and that is what you are finally allowing yourself to receive. Protection in adulthood looks different than what was missing in childhood. In childhood, protection would have meant being understood, being seen accurately, being known for who you actually were, having your complexity appreciated rather than reduced. But that did not happen, and you cannot go back and change it. So protection now means something else. It means choosing people who try to understand. It means walking away from people who repeatedly misinterpret you. It means not accepting relationships where reduction is the norm. It means surrounding yourself with people who value complexity, who ask questions, who are curious, who do not need you to be simple in order to love you. And this protection is active, is deliberate, is something you create through choice, through boundaries, through walking away from what does not serve you, and staying present to what does. Protection now means walking away from people who refuse to understand. It means not staying in relationships where you must constantly translate yourself. It means not accepting being defined incorrectly. It means not tolerating being reduced to manageable versions. It means setting a standard that says I will only be in relationship with people who want to know me, not just a version they find acceptable. And this standard is not harsh, is not unreasonable, is basic respect. And people who love you will meet it, will try to understand, will ask questions, will make effort, will appreciate complexity. And people who cannot meet it, who need you simple, who require performance, are telling you something. They are telling you they are not capable of being in relationship with the real you. And that information, while painful, is valuable, is clarifying, is protective, because it saves you from wasting years with people who will never fully see you. And your years matter, your energy matters, your life matters. And protection means not giving it to people who cannot appreciate what they are receiving. Protection is no longer about making yourself simpler. It is about refusing to shrink. It is about choosing people who want to know you, not just a manageable version of you. And that is not being difficult. That is having standards. That is self-respect. That is recognizing that your complexity is not a problem, is not a flaw, is not something to be apologized for, is just who you are, and who you are deserves to be loved, fully, accurately, complexly, without translation, without performance, without hiding. And protection means building a life where that is possible, where the people around you can hold you, can know you, can love you as you are, and that life is not a fantasy, is not unrealistic, is possible, is achievable, is what you are building right now, through your choices, through your boundaries, through your refusal to accept less than you deserve. And that building is healing, is growth, is reclaiming your life, and it is worth every difficult choice, every boundary set, every person walked away from, because what you are building is real, is authentic, is yours, and that is everything. The person who was never understood learned something most people never do. They learned what it means to be reduced, to be simplified, to be projected upon. They learned what it feels like to love someone who does not know you, to be with someone while being unseen, to explain yourself repeatedly and never be grasped. And through this learning, they developed something. They developed appreciation for being understood, for people who see accurately, for relationships that do not require translation. They developed deep self-knowledge, because if no one else was going to know them, they had to know themselves. They developed capacity to hold complexity in others, because they know what it is like to be reduced and refuse to do that to others. They developed the ability to recognize performance, to see when someone is hiding, to notice when someone is translating, because they lived it, and they became people who offer real understanding, who actually listen, who ask questions, who appreciate depth, who value complexity. And these capacities are real, are valuable, are meaningful. And while they came at a cost, while they were born from pain, they are still real. And they make them people who change lives, who offer healing through understanding, who see people accurately when everyone else reduces them. But self-knowledge without self-acceptance is self-criticism. And seeing others accurately while being unseen yourself is isolation. So the gifts are real, and so is the cost. What they developed through being misunderstood is valuable, but what they lost is also valuable. They lost years of being known, years of authentic connection, years of being loved for who they actually are. And that loss is real, is significant, is worthy of grief, And honoring the gifts does not erase the loss, does not make the pain worthwhile, does not mean they should be grateful for being misunderstood. The gifts are real. The cost is real. Both matter. Both shaped who they became, and both deserve acknowledgement. Without one negating the other, they became people with extraordinary self-awareness and capacity for empathy. And they also became people who hide themselves and doubt their own experience. Both are true, both are real, and healing means holding both. Appreciating the strength without romanticizing the pain. Acknowledging the capacity without minimizing the cost, and moving forward with both, using the strength, releasing the pain, and building something new, something based on being known, on being seen, on being loved fully. And that is possible, that is achievable, that is what healing creates, and they are ready to receive it, to experience it, to live it, finally. The person who was never understood grew into an adult who knows how to hide, who knows how to translate, who knows how to perform acceptable versions of themselves, who knows how to survive being reduced, simplified, misunderstood. And these are real skills, survival skills, skills that kept them safe when being fully themselves felt dangerous. But survival was never the goal. Survival is what you do when you have no choice, when the alternative is worse, when you're just trying to make it through. But there is supposed to be more than survival. There is supposed to be living, and living is different. Living means being yourself, not a translated version, not a simplified version, not a performed version, just yourself, complex, contradictory, multifaceted, deep, and being known that way, being loved that way, being appreciated that way, not despite complexity, but including it, valuing it, wanting it. The next chapter is about learning what living looks like, learning to be known without constant translation, learning to be complex without apology, learning to be yourself without fear, learning to trust that the right people will understand, learning to walk away from people who do not, learning to believe that understanding is possible, that you're not too complicated, that depth is not a burden, that being yourself is enough, more than enough. It is exactly what is wanted by the right people at the right time in the right relationships. And those relationships are possible, are available, are waiting for you to be ready, to be authentic, to be yourself, and you are ready, or you are becoming ready, or you will be ready. And when you are, when you drop the performance, when you stop translating, when you show yourself fully, the right people will see you, and they will stay, and they will love you. Not a version of you, but you, actually, truly, complexly, and that love will feel different, will feel real, will feel like finally, you are known. And being known, you realize, is what you were seeking all along, not universal understanding, not being grasped by everyone, just being known by the right ones, just being seen accurately by people who matter, just being loved fully by people capable of loving you. And that is possible. That is real. That is what healing makes available. And you are ready to receive it. And slowly, over time, the nervous system learns something it never did before, that being yourself does not equal being rejected. That complexity is not a burden, that the right people will understand you without endless explanation, that you're not too much. You just loved people who were too little, too unwilling, too incapable of seeing beyond their own projections. And that was never about you. That was always about them, their capacity, their limitation, their unwillingness to do the work of knowing you. And you internalized their limitation as your flaw. You accepted their incapacity as your problem. You made their lack of effort your responsibility. But it was never yours. It was always theirs. And this shift, when it finally lands, changes everything. It doesn't change who you are. You were always complex, always deep, always multifaceted. But it changes how you relate to who you are, with acceptance instead of apology, with pride instead of shame, with presence instead of performance. And it changes who gets access to you. Not everyone, just the people willing to actually know you, the people curious enough to understand, the people capable enough to hold complexity. And those people, when you find them, when you let them see you, when you drop the performance and show them who you actually are, they don't run. They don't simplify you. They don't reduce you to something manageable. They see you fully, accurately, complexly, and they love you. Not a version of you, but you, your contradictions, your depth, your nuance, your complications, all of it. They love all of it because it is you, and you are worth loving, not despite complexity, but as you are, fully, completely, without translation, without performance, without apology, just you. And that is not too much to ask for. That is the minimum. That is what you deserved all along. And that is what healing makes possible. Not being understood by everyone, but being known by the right ones. And that is not weakness. That is healing.